The dust-stained letter trembled in Clara Wilson's hands as she stood alone on the porch, the Kansas prairie wind whipping her skirts against her legs. Barren. The doctor's elegant script seemed to mock her as tears blurred her vision. 3 years of marriage, and still no child to grace their home, no future to plan for just endless months of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. She crumpled the paper, pressing it against her chest as if she could somehow force the words to change, to give her something other than this emptiness that stretched wider than the plains before her. Clara had traveled all the way to Topeka to see the specialist, spending nearly all of their savings for his expert opinion, only to return with confirmation of what she'd feared most. She couldn't bear children. Ever. The finality of it struck her harder than the relentless sun beating down on her shoulders. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her hastily wipe her tears and tuck the letter into her pocket. It was 1871, and crying on the porch of their modest homestead wouldn't change anything. She straightened her spine as her husband's figure appeared on the horizon. Thomas Quinn had been many things in his 30 years: cowhand, trail driver, and now a respectable rancher with dreams as vast as the Kansas sky. He'd taken to ranching in the last 2 years with the same determination that had first caught Clara's eye when he arrived in Willow Creek. His broad shoulders and strong hands spoke of hard work, but it was his gentle smile that had won her heart. Thomas slowed his horse to a walk as he approached the house, his keen eyes taking in Clara's red-rimmed eyes and rigid posture. Something was wrong, something beyond the usual struggles of frontier life. "Clara!" He swung down from his saddle, dust rising around his boots as he landed. The concern in his voice nearly undid her composure. "Welcome home," she said, her voice catching. "How was town?" Thomas approached slowly, hat in hand, studying her face. Town was the same as always. He hesitated, then asked, "Did you receive word from the doctor?" Clara nodded, unable to speak. She pulled the crumpled letter from her pocket and handed it to him, then turned away. She couldn't bear to watch his face as he read it, couldn't stand to see disappointment replace the hope that had sustained them both. Thomas read in silence, the only sound the fluttering of the paper in the wind. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it in his vest pocket. Clara braced herself, waiting for the words that would surely come: regret, perhaps, or the suggestion that he deserved a wife who could give him children. Instead, she felt his arms encircle her from behind, drawing her against his chest. His cheek rested against her hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know how much you wanted this." Clara turned in his arms, her composure finally breaking as she pressed her face against his shirt. "What will we do now? We've been planning for a family. It's all we've talked about." Her voice cracked. "What's the point of all this without children?" Thomas held her tighter. "The point is us, Clara, you and me. That's always been enough for me." "But you deserve—" "Don't tell me what I deserve," he interrupted gently. "I chose you. I'll always choose you." Clara pulled back, searching his face for any sign of deception. All she found was the same steady gaze that had supported her through 3 years of marriage. But what about a legacy? Something to build for, something to leave behind. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting to the vast expanse of land surrounding their home. Then he took her hand and led her to the edge of the porch. "Look out there, Clara. What do you see?" She followed his gaze across their property, the small ranch house they'd built together, the barn and corral beyond, the beginnings of a cattle operation that Thomas had poured his heart into. Further still, the open prairie stretching toward the horizon, dotted with wildflowers that had emerged after the spring rains. "I see our home," she said softly. "I see possibilities," Thomas replied. "Life finds a way to grow everywhere out here, doesn't it? Even in the hardest places." That night, Clara lay awake long after Thomas had fallen asleep. His steady breathing beside her was usually comforting, but tonight it couldn't quiet her thoughts. She slipped from bed and moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit land. What did her life mean now? Since girlhood, She'd been taught that a woman's purpose was to be a wife and mother. She'd fulfilled the first part, but the second now seemed an impossible dream. The weight of that loss pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. Outside, a coyote called into the darkness, its lonely howl echoing across the prairie. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling just as solitary, just as adrift. The next morning, Thomas was gone before dawn, leaving only a note saying he had business in town. Clara moved through her chores mechanically, feeding the chickens and gathering eggs with little awareness of her actions. By mid-morning, the emptiness of the house pressed in on her, and she decided to walk the property anything to escape her thoughts. She had just returned when she spotted Thomas's horse approaching, but he wasn't alone. His wagon followed behind, loaded with what appeared to be lumber, tools, and several burlap sacks. Clara frowned, stepping off the porch as he pulled up to the house. "Thomas Quinn, what in heaven's name have you done?" she called. He climbed down from the wagon with a mysterious smile. "I've been thinking, Clara, about what you said yesterday about having something to build for, something to leave behind." She approached the wagon cautiously, peering at its contents. "And that required half the mercantile, did it?" Thomas laughed, the sound warming her despite her confusion. "Not half, maybe a quarter." His expression grew more serious as he took her hands in his. "I can't give you a child, Clara. I wish to God I could. But I thought maybe—" He hesitated. "I thought maybe we could create something else together. Something that grows and changes, something that's ours." Clara's brow furrowed. "I don't understand." Thomas led her around to the back of the wagon and untied one of the burlap sacks. He reached inside and pulled out a packet of seeds, then another and another. "I talked with Mrs. Hanson at the general store. She helped me choose plants that would thrive here, vegetables, herbs, flowers." He gestured to the lumber in the wagon. "I thought we could build a garden, a proper one, with raised beds and a fence to keep the rabbits out, maybe even a little greenhouse eventually so you could grow things year-round." Clara stared at the seeds in his hands, her vision blurring. "A garden?" Thomas nodded, suddenly looking uncertain. "I know it's not the same as—" "It's perfect," Clara interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up at him, tears spilling freely now. "It's absolutely perfect, Thomas." Relief flooded his features. "Really? Because if you don't want to—" Clara silenced him by rising on her tiptoes to press her lips against his. When she pulled away, she was smiling through her tears. "Show me where you think we should put it." Thomas's face lit up. He took her hand and led her to a spot between the house and the barn where the morning sun would warm the soil, but the afternoon shade would provide some protection from the harsh summer heat. "I thought here," he said, marking out a rectangle with his boot in the dirt. "It's close enough to fetch water easily, but far enough from the house that we can expand it if you want to." Clara walked the perimeter of his makeshift outline, trying to envision what it might become. For the first time since receiving the doctor's letter, she felt a spark of something like hope. "When can we start?" she asked. Thomas grinned. "How about right now?" They worked side by side for the rest of the day, Thomas showing Clara how to use the tools he'd purchased. She watched in awe as the garden began to take shape under their hands, Thomas building the frames for the raised beds, while Clara sifted through the soil, removing rocks and breaking up clumps. By the time the sun began to set, they were filthy, exhausted, and happier than they'd been in months. The foundation of their garden was laid, and though it was still just dirt and wood, Clara could already see its potential. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Thomas put his arm around Clara's shoulders. "What do you think you'll plant first?" Clara leaned into him, considering. "Tomatoes, I think, and maybe some sunflowers along the back edge." She hesitated, then added, "My mother always grew sunflowers. She said they reminded her that even on the hardest days we should turn our faces to the light." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "Your mother was a wise woman." The next morning, Clara woke with purpose for the first time since her devastating news. She dressed quickly and was outside before Thomas had even finished his coffee, eager to continue their work. Over the next few weeks, the garden took shape. Thomas built a sturdy fence to keep out wildlife and crafted a gate that swung smoothly on its hinges. Clara prepared the soil, mixing in manure from the barn and the rich compost they'd been accumulating. Together, they created something neither had initially imagined, but that now seemed an essential part of their home. The day they were ready to plant, Clara stood at the center of the garden, seed packets spread before her, a map drawn on a scrap of paper, showing where each variety should go. Thomas watched from the gate, his heart full at the sight of his wife, flushed with excitement, dirt streaking her cheeks, more alive than he'd seen her in months. "Are you going to help or just stand there gawking?" she called to him, laughing. He joined her willingly, following her instructions as they pressed seeds into the dark earth, covering them gently and watering them with care. When they finished, Clara stood back surveying their work. "Now we wait," she said softly. "And tend," Thomas added, slipping his arm around her waist. "The best things require patience and attention." Clara leaned against him, thinking how true that was of gardens and marriages. The first green shoots appeared 5 days later. Clara discovered them early in the morning and ran back to the house, breathless with excitement. "Thomas! Thomas, come quickly!" He rushed outside, fearing something was wrong, only to find Clara beaming with joy as she dragged him to the garden. She pointed to the tiny sprouts pushing through the soil, fragile, pale green promises of life. "Look," she whispered, kneeling beside the bed. "They're growing." Thomas crouched next to her, marveling at her wonder over something so small. "Of course they are. You're giving them exactly what they need." As spring warmed into summer, the garden flourished under Clara's devoted care. She spent hours there each day, weeding, watering, supporting climbing plants with stakes Thomas had fashioned. The first time she brought a basket of fresh vegetables to the dinner table, lettuces, radishes, and tender young carrots, her pride was palpable. "These are the best vegetables I've ever tasted," Thomas declared, crunching into a radish. Clara laughed. "You're biased." "I'm honest," he countered, reaching across the table to take her hand. "And I'm proud of you." Word of Clara's garden spread through Willow Creek. The minister's wife came to see it, then the blacksmith's family, followed by several other women from town. Soon, Clara found herself hosting informal gatherings where she shared seeds, cuttings, and advice. For the first time since moving to Kansas, she felt truly connected to the community. One afternoon in late July, as Clara was harvesting beans with her friend Martha Jenkins, the conversation turned to children. "Daniel's hoping for another boy," Martha said, patting her swollen belly. "But I'd be happy with either, long as the baby's healthy." Clara nodded, keeping her eyes on her task. Martha was pregnant with her 4th child, and while Clara had made peace with her situation, moments like these still stung. Martha must have sensed her discomfort because she quickly changed the subject. "These beans are magnificent. You have quite a gift, Clara. Not everyone can make things grow like this." Clara looked up, surprised by the earnestness in her friend's voice. "It's just gardening," Martha shook her head. "It's nurturing. It's creating life and helping it thrive." She gestured around the garden, which was now a riot of colors and textures. "You're growing more than vegetables here. You're growing beauty, food, community." She smiled gently. "There are many ways to mother, Clara." That evening, as Clara prepared dinner with the day's harvest, she found herself mulling over Martha's words. She glanced out the window to where Thomas was mending a fence, his movements sure and steady. He had given her this gift, not just the garden itself, but the opportunity to discover a new purpose. When they sat down to eat, Clara reached for Thomas's hand before he could say grace. "Thank you," she said simply. His eyebrows rose. "For what?" "For knowing what I needed before I did. For the garden." She squeezed his hand. "For loving me enough to help me find another way to grow something." Thomas's eyes softened. "Clara, loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." By August, the garden was producing more than they could eat. Clara began preserving canning tomatoes, pickling cucumbers, drying herbs to hang from the kitchen rafters. The rich sense of harvest filled their home, and the pantry shelves grew heavy with colorful jars. One morning, as Clara was watering the late summer plantings, she noticed a wagon approaching. It wasn't anyone she recognized from town. She set down her watering can and moved to the front of the house, shading her eyes against the sun. A young couple sat on the wagon seat, looking travel-worn and hesitant. The woman couldn't have been more than 20, her face drawn with exhaustion. In her arms was a bundle that Clara realized with a start was an infant. "Hello there," Clara called, approaching the wagon. "Can I help you?" The man removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached hair and a weary expression. "Begging your pardon, madam, we're looking for the Quinn place." Clara's brow furrowed. "This is it. I'm Mrs. Quinn, Clara Quinn." The couple exchanged a glance before the man spoke again. "I'm Robert Wells. This is my wife, Emma, and our daughter, Lily." He hesitated. I'm looking for Thomas Quinn. I was told in town he might be able to offer work." "My husband's out with the cattle," Clara replied. "He should be back by noon." She noticed the woman's pallor and the way she swayed slightly on the seat. "Why don't you come inside? You look like you could use some rest and refreshment." Relief washed over their faces. Clara helped Emma down from the wagon, while Robert saw to the horses. The baby fussed as they moved toward the house, and Clara caught a glimpse of a tiny red face. "How old is she?" Clara asked, trying to keep the wistfulness from her voice. "Just 6 weeks," Emma answered, her voice soft with exhaustion and pride. "She's been a good traveler, all things considered." Inside, Clara bustled about, setting out cold cider and leftover cornbread, while Emma settled in a chair, the baby at her breast. Robert explained their situation. They'd lost their farm in Missouri to drought and debt, and were heading west in hopes of a fresh start. "We've got family in Colorado," he said, "but we're running low on funds. I need work, at least for a while, to build up our savings before we continue on." Clara nodded, her heart going out to the young family. "Thomas has been talking about hiring help. The herd's growing, and he can't manage it all alone anymore." Emma's gaze drifted to the window, where the vibrant colors of Clara's garden were visible. "Your garden is beautiful," she said wistfully. "I had to leave all my seedlings behind when we lost the farm." Clara's face brightened. "Would you like to see it?" With the baby fed and sleeping, Emma followed Clara outside, leaving Robert to rest in the shade of the porch. Clara showed her through the garden, explaining what she'd planted and how it was thriving. Emma's genuine interest warmed her, and Clara found herself offering cuttings and seeds for when they reached their new home. "You're very kind," Emma said, tears suddenly brimming in her eyes. "We've met so many who turned us away." Clara impulsively reached for the younger woman's hand. The frontier is hard enough without facing it alone. When Thomas returned, he found Clara and the Wells family seated around the kitchen table, sharing the lunch Clara had prepared. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene with surprise. Clara made the introductions and explained the couple's situation. Thomas listened thoughtfully, his eyes assessing Robert. "Have you worked cattle before?" he asked. Robert nodded. "Yes, sir. My father ran a small operation back in Missouri. I've been handling livestock since I was a boy." Thomas glanced at Clara, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Well," he said, turning back to Robert, "I do need help. I can offer fair wages and a place to stay until you're ready to move on." He gestured toward a small cabin visible from the window. "It's not much, but it's weather-tight. Was for the previous hand, before he moved on to Nebraska." Robert's face lit up. "That would be more than generous, sir." Emma looked between her husband and the Quinns, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "You'd do that for strangers?" Clara smiled. "We were all strangers once." The Wells family moved into the cabin that afternoon. It needed cleaning and minor repairs, but by sundown it was habitable. Clara provided them with fresh linens and a basket of food from her garden. As she handed it to Emma, the baby began to cry. "May I?" Clara asked hesitantly, nodding toward the infant. Emma carefully transferred Lily to Clara's arms. The weight of the tiny body, the soft warmth of her, sent a pang through Clara's heart. But there was joy, too, in holding this new life, in being trusted with her care. "You're a natural," Emma observed as Clara gently rocked the fussing baby into contentment. Clara smiled, not trusting herself to speak. When she finally handed Lily back, Emma touched her arm. Would you like to help me with her sometimes? It gets lonely being with just a baby all day." Clara nodded, grateful beyond words for this unexpected gift. Over the next few weeks, a rhythm developed on the Quinn ranch. Thomas and Robert worked with the cattle, expanding the herd and improving the fencing. Clara tended her garden and helped Emma with Lily, showing the young mother how to make herbal remedies for the baby's colic and teaching her to preserve the late summer harvest. One evening in early September, as the two couples sat on the Quinn's porch after dinner, Robert hesitantly raised a subject he'd clearly been pondering. "Thomas, Mrs. Quinn," he began, "Emma and I have been talking. We're grateful for all you've done for us," but he glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. "The thing is, we're not sure Colorado's right for us anymore. Emma's family there, they're not exactly welcoming. And here," he gestured around the ranch, "we found something we didn't expect." Thomas leaned forward. "What are you saying, Robert?" "We're saying we'd like to stay if you'll have us," Emma answered, "not just as hired help, but maybe as partners, eventually." She turned to Clara. "I know it's presumptuous." "No," Clara interrupted, her mind racing with possibilities. "No, it's not presumptuous at all." She looked at Thomas, seeing the same consideration in his eyes that she felt. The ranch was growing, and they'd discussed expanding, but had hesitated, knowing it was too much for just the two of them, and the Welleses had proven themselves hard-working and honest over the past weeks. "Let us discuss it," Thomas said carefully. "It's a big decision for all of us." That night, as Clara and Thomas lay in bed, they talked long into the darkness. "They're good people," Thomas said. "Robert knows cattle, and Emma's been a real help to you, hasn't she?" Clara nodded against his chest. "She has. And Lily," she hesitated. "Having her here, watching her grow, it's given me something I didn't know I needed." Thomas's arm tightened around her. "Does it hurt, though, having them so close with their baby?" Clara considered this honestly. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but mostly it feels like a gift. Like our family is growing, just not in the way we expected." She propped herself up to look at him. "What do you think? Could you truly see them as partners here?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that the best gardens have many different plants growing together. Each one brings something the others need." Clara smiled in the darkness, recognizing his answer for what it was. "Then, we should tell them yes." The partnership was formalized the following week, with a visit to the lawyer in town. The Quinns would retain majority ownership, but the Welleses would work toward an increasing share over time. It was an unusual arrangement, especially for a woman to be included, but Clara insisted that Emma's name be on the papers alongside Robert's. "If something happens to Robert," she explained to the skeptical lawyer, "Emma shouldn't lose her claim to what they've built together." As autumn painted the prairie in golds and reds, the two families settled into a partnership that went beyond business. They shared meals, chores, and increasingly, their lives. Clara's garden became a gathering place where she taught Emma her growing knowledge while Lily played on a blanket in the shade. One crisp October afternoon, as Clara was showing Emma how to divide perennials for next year's planting, Lily rolled over for the first time. The women's delighted exclamations brought Thomas and Robert running from the barn, concerned until they saw the cause for celebration. "Look at you, clever girl," Clara crooned, kneeling beside the baby, who seemed quite pleased with herself. When Lily reached for her, Clara scooped her up, pressing a kiss to her downy head. Later, after the Welleses had gone back to their cabin, Thomas found Clara still in the garden, sitting quietly among her plants as twilight settled around her. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, lowering himself to the ground beside her. Clara leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. I was thinking about how things grow, she said. Not just plants, but families too. How they branch out in unexpected ways. Thomas nodded, understanding without her having to explain further. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. Are you happy, Clara, with how things have turned out? She considered the question, thinking of the barrenness she had feared would define her life. Instead, she had found fertility in other ways, in the soil she tended, in the community she was building, in the love that had expanded to include not just Thomas, but the Welleses too. I am, she said, and was surprised to realize how completely she meant it. Are you? Thomas gazed out over the garden Clara had created, now preparing for its winter rest. Beyond it lay the ranch they were building together, not just for themselves, but for others too. More than I ever thought possible, he answered honestly. As winter settled over the prairie, the two families drew closer together. The women preserved the last of the garden's bounty and began planning for spring plantings. The men worked on improvements to both houses and built a larger barn to accommodate their growing herd. Christmas was a joyous affair, with gifts crafted by hand and a feast that showcased Clara's preserved garden treasures. Lily, now crawling and babbling, became the center of attention, enchanted by the candles on the small tree Thomas had cut from the creek bottom. As Clara watched Thomas swing the baby high, making her shriek with laughter, she felt a fullness in her heart that had nothing to do with the traditional family she'd once envisioned and everything to do with the one they were creating on their own terms. That night, after their guests had gone and the house was quiet, Clara and Thomas sat by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. I have something for you, he said softly, reaching into his pocket. One more Christmas gift. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Clara unwrapped it curiously to find a journal bound in soft leather with her initials stamped into the cover. It's beautiful, she said, running her fingers over the smooth surface. I thought you might use it to record your garden, Thomas explained. What works, what doesn't, so you can remember, and maybe someday share it with others. Clara opened the journal to find the first page already inscribed in Thomas's careful handwriting. For Clara, who teaches me daily how to grow love in unexpected places, may this record the garden of your heart as it blooms through the seasons of our life together. Tears pricked her eyes as she traced his words. Thank you, she whispered, turning to kiss him softly. For everything. Thomas cradled her face in his hands. Thank you for showing me that family isn't just blood. It's what we choose to nurture together. Spring returned to the prairie with a rush of green and a chorus of birdsong. Clara's garden awakened, perennials pushing through the soil, seeds sprouting in neat rows. This year, the garden had expanded, with Robert building additional raised beds and a small greenhouse where Clara could start seedlings early. On a warm May morning, Clara was working in the garden, Lily toddling alongside her on sturdy legs, when Emma joined them, her face alight with news. Clara, she said breathlessly, I'm expecting again. The baby will come in November. Clara's hands stilled in the soil. For a moment the old pain surfaced, but only for a moment. She rose and embraced her friend, genuinely happy for her. That's wonderful news, Emma, truly wonderful. Emma hugged her back, then pulled away to look into Clara's face. I wanted to ask, would you help me through it, like a midwife? There's no one I trust more. Clara blinked, stunned by the request. Me? But I've never. You helped birth the Harper's calf last month, Emma pointed out. And you know more about herbs and healing than anyone in the county. Besides, she added softly, you're family now. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. I would be honored, she said. That evening, Clara told Thomas about Emma's request. His face reflected her own mixture of emotions, the lingering sadness for what they couldn't have, but also pride and a deep sense of purpose. You'll be wonderful, he assured her, drawing her into his arms. You already mother in so many ways. Clara rested against him, thinking about how much had changed in the year since that devastating letter from the doctor. The path she'd expected to walk had disappeared, but in its place, she'd found another one filled with different joys, different challenges, but just as meaningful. Summer passed in a blur of activity. The ranch prospered, with the cattle herd nearly doubling and the first significant profits allowing for improvements to both houses. Clara's garden flourished, producing enough that she began selling preserves and fresh vegetables in town, earning her own income for the first time in her life. As Emma's belly grew, Clara studied midwifery with renewed purpose, reading every book she could obtain and consulting with the town's elderly midwife, Mrs. Peterson. She prepared tinctures and teas for Emma's morning sickness and swollen ankles, and each evening recorded her observations and learnings in the journal Thomas had given her. One night in early autumn, as Clara wrote by lamplight, Thomas looked up from the ledger where he was recording the ranch accounts. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I was thinking about adding a small orchard next year. Apples, maybe some plums. What do you think?" Clara set down her pen, considering. "I think it's a wonderful idea. Trees take time to bear fruit, though." Thomas smiled. "That's all right. We're not going anywhere." The simple statement filled Clara with contentment. They were putting down roots, creating something enduring. It might not be the legacy they'd initially imagined, but it was meaningful nonetheless. November brought colder weather, and with it, Emma's time. The baby arrived on a clear, cold night, with Clara guiding Emma through each contraction while Robert paced nervously outside. When the infant's cry finally pierced the night, Clara felt a rush of accomplishment unlike anything she'd experienced before. "It's a boy," she announced, placing the squalling infant on Emma's chest. "A perfect, healthy boy." As she watched the new parents marvel over their son, Clara felt no envy, only joy, and a bone-deep satisfaction in having helped bring this new life safely into the world. Later, after mother and baby were resting comfortably, and Robert had finally been persuaded to get some sleep, Clara made her way home through the starlit darkness. Thomas was waiting on the porch, a lantern in hand. "All well?" he asked, his breath visible in the cold air. Clara nodded, suddenly exhausted but exhilarated. "A boy. They're naming him Thomas Robert, after you and his father." Thomas's expression softened with surprise and pleasure. "That's quite an honor." "It is," Clara agreed, taking his hand as they went inside. "And a deserved one." By the warmth of their fire, Clara described the birth, while Thomas listened attentively, his pride in her evident. When she finished, he rose and went to a cabinet, returning with a small package. "I was saving this for Christmas," he said, "but I think tonight is the right time." Clara unwrapped the gift to find a beautifully carved wooden sign. Burned into the wood were the words, "Clara's Garden and Midwifery." "Thomas?" she questioned, running her fingers over the letters. "Mrs. Peterson is getting on in years," he explained. "She mentioned to me that Willow Creek will need a new midwife soon. She thinks you have a gift for it." Clara stared at the sign, her heart racing. "You think I could?" Thomas sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "I think you already are. Tonight proved that. And it seems right, doesn't it? Helping bring new life into the world, tending to mothers and babies, using the knowledge you've gained from your garden and your studies." His eyes held hers steadily. "You found your way to nurture, Clara. A different way than we expected, but no less important." Clara leaned forward to kiss him, overcome with gratitude for this man who had helped her find purpose when all seemed lost. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "And I love you," he answered, more with each passing day. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on Clara's wide-brimmed hat as she moved through her garden, now 3 times its original size. Rows of vegetables stretched in all directions, interspersed with medicinal herbs and flowers that attracted beneficial insects. A small orchard bloomed behind it, the trees Thomas had planted now beginning to bear fruit. Clara's hands, tanned and strong from years of working the soil, gently harvested chamomile flowers for drying, Her basket was nearly full when she heard the familiar sound of children's laughter approaching. "Aunt Clara! Aunt Clara!" Lily Wells, now 6 years old, came running down the path between the garden beds, careful not to step on any plants. Behind her, more sedately, came her 4-year-old brother Thomas and 2-year-old sister Hannah, hand in hand. "Look what we found," Lily exclaimed, holding out a turtle the size of her palm. "Can we keep it in the garden to eat the bad bugs?" Clara set down her basket and crouched to examine the turtle. "Well, now, that's a box turtle. They do eat some garden pests, but they also need freedom to roam." She smiled at the children's eager faces. "How about we make a special place for him to visit, with some lettuce leaves and a shallow dish of water, but then let him decide if he wants to stay?" The children nodded solemnly, accepting her wisdom as they always did in matters of nature. Together, they created a small turtle haven in a corner of the garden. From the house came Emma's voice, calling the children for lunch. As they scampered away, Clara straightened, pressing a hand to the small of her back. At 33, she felt the aches of physical labor more than she once had, but they were honest aches, earned through work she loved. She gathered her basket and headed toward the house, passing the large sign that now marked the entrance to her garden. Below Clara's garden and midwifery had been added the words, "and School of Herbal Arts," reflecting the classes she now taught to women from Willow Creek and neighboring towns. Inside, the house had expanded along with their enterprise. A new wing contained Clara's workshop, where she prepared remedies and tended to patients, and a classroom space for her teachings. The original rooms had been renovated as well, with large windows overlooking the garden and comfortable furnishings for the gatherings they frequently hosted. Emma was setting out lunch for the children when Clara entered. "The Robertson baby has arrived," she announced. "A girl, 7 pounds. Mrs. Peterson sends word that mother and child are doing well, and she didn't need our assistance after all." Clara nodded, relieved. At 78, Mrs. Peterson still attended births occasionally, but more and more often, it was Clara who was called to help bring Willow Creek's babies into the world. In the 5 years since she'd begun her midwifery practice, she'd delivered over 40 infants, with Mrs. Peterson's guidance gradually giving way to Clara's own confident knowledge. "That's good to hear," Clara said, washing her hands at the sink. "Is Thomas back yet?" "Not yet," Emma replied. "He and Robert rode out to the north pasture to check on that new bull. They should be back by supper." The ranch had prospered beyond anyone's expectations. What had begun as Thomas's modest cattle operation was now one of the largest in the county, with the Wellses having earned their full partnership 3 years earlier. The two families had considered building a second house, but ultimately decided to expand the existing structures instead, preserving the closeness that had sustained them through the years. As Clara helped serve lunch to the children, she marveled at how seamlessly their lives had intertwined. Lily, Thomas, and Hannah called her and Thomas aunt and uncle, but the bonds went deeper than any title could express. The children spent as much time in the Quinn's home as in their own, learning from Clara about plants and healing, from Thomas about cattle and horses. After lunch, while the children napped and Emma tended to household tasks, Clara returned to her workshop. A young woman from town was coming at 3 o'clock to learn about herbs for women's monthly discomforts, and Clara wanted to prepare the necessary materials. As she worked, sorting dried herbs into small packets and writing out instructions, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The devastation of learning she couldn't bear children had seemed like an ending, but it had been instead a beginning, the start of a different path than the one she'd expected, but one no less fulfilling. Her garden had started as Thomas's gift to her, a way to help her grow something of her own when the children she longed for couldn't be conceived. It had become much more, the foundation of a calling that brought healing and comfort to others, a source of sustenance for their extended family, and a place of learning for anyone willing to listen to the wisdom of plants. And family that, too, had grown in unexpected ways. The Wellses, who had arrived as strangers seeking temporary work, were now as much a part of her life as if they shared blood. Their children filled the Quinn home with laughter and questions and small crises that Clara helped resolve with herbs and hugs and patient explanations. When her student arrived, Clara welcomed her warmly, recognizing in the young woman's anxious expression the same uncertainty she herself had felt when facing an unexpected future. "Don't worry," she assured her, leading the way to the work table. "You'll learn. That's what we all do, isn't it? Learn to work with what life gives us, not what we thought it would be." That evening, with both families gathered around the long table on the Quinn's porch for supper, Thomas raised his glass in a toast. "To 10 years, he said, his eyes finding Clara's across the table. 10 years since we stood before the preacher and promised each other forever." Clara smiled, remembering the hopeful young woman she'd been, with dreams of a house full of children who would have Thomas's eyes and her determination. Those specific dreams had faded, replaced by a reality richer and more complex than she could have imagined. "To growth," she added, lifting her own glass, "in all its forms." Later, when the dishes were cleared and the Welleses had gone home with their sleepy children, Thomas and Clara walked hand in hand through the garden in the gathering dusk. Fireflies rose from the plants, their soft lights blinking on and off like earthbound stars. "Are you happy, Clara?" Thomas asked, echoing a question he'd posed many times over the years. It was their way of checking in with each other, of ensuring that the life they were building remained true to both their needs. Clara stopped, turning to face him in the fading light. The years had etched fine lines around his eyes and silvered his temples, but he was still the man who had seen her through her darkest time, who had built her a garden when she thought all hope of nurturing life was lost. "I am," she said, with the deep certainty of someone who had found her purpose, "completely and utterly happy." She reached up to touch his face. "Are you?" Thomas caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Every day with you is a blessing I never thought to deserve." They continued their walk, moving between the rows of plants Clara had tended into abundance. Around them, the prairie stretched vast and open under the emerging stars, a reminder of how small their place in the world was, and yet, within that place, they had created something meaningful, something that would outlast them both. Clara thought of the journal Thomas had given her that long-ago Christmas, now filled with years of observations, recipes, and wisdom. She had started a second volume, and then a third, each one documenting not just the growth of plants, but the growth of a life, a family, a community. Someday those journals would pass to others, to the Wells children perhaps, or to one of Clara's students who showed particular promise. That, she realized, was legacy. Not necessarily children of your blood, but the passing on of knowledge, of values, of ways to nurture and heal. Her garden had taught her that growth takes many forms, and that what matters most is not the shape it takes, but the love that sustains it. As the last light faded from the sky, Thomas drew Clara close against the evening chill. Together, they looked out over the garden that had saved her, the garden that had shown her another way to mother, the garden that had grown into a life's work neither of them could have predicted. "Thank you," she whispered, the words meant for Thomas, but also for the soil, the seeds, the sun and rain, for all that had conspired to help her find her way. Thomas's arm tightened around her shoulders. "For what?" "For knowing exactly what I needed to grow." Clara leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her side. "And for growing alongside me." In the distance, a coyote called into the darkness, its voice rising toward the moon. But Clara felt no kinship with its loneliness now. She was rooted, connected, part of something larger than herself. The barrenness she had feared had blossomed into abundance, and the legacy she had thought lost had simply taken a different form. Here, in this garden, in this life she and Thomas had built together, Clara had found her truest self, not defined by what she couldn't do, but by what she could. By what she did, every day, with her hands in the earth and her heart open to possibilities she once couldn't have imagined. And that, she knew with bone-deep certainty as Thomas led her back toward their home, was the most fertile ground of all.